A very good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Hindu News Analysis brought to you by Shankar IAS Academy. Here are the list of news articles chosen for discussion today, and our video is time-stamped for your convenience. Now let us take up this news article. So this article is about the observations made by the economics research team of the State Bank of India regarding the state of the Indian economy. So they have warned that India's economic recovery could be delayed. And the reason for this is the rising financial stress on the households along with the inflation. See, the financial stress is not because of the health expenditure, but it is due to the expenditure on the oil. That's what the report says. See, the increased expenditure on oil or fuel is due to the increased fuel prices. We know the petrol and diesel has hit the 100 rupees mark in many places. So this scenario has even reduced the spending on the non-discretionary items like grocery and utility services. Here you need to understand what is this consumer discretionary products and what is this non-discretionary items and all. See, consumer discretionary product is a term used for classifying goods and services that are considered non-essential by the consumers. But these goods and services are considered desirable by the consumers, and these goods will be bought by the consumers only if their available income is sufficient to purchase them beyond the essential items. For example, high-end apparels or going to a movie or leisure activities and say buying a car. So these are things that are not essential for the survival of an individual, right? But they can be considered as a luxury or a non-essential product, and we ourselves will invest in these products only if our income satisfies first the essentials of the food and the clothing that we basically require, and only over and above we'll spend for these products, right? So this is what we mean by here. See, the spending on these products provides a picture on the state of economy as well. See, generally when the economy is strong, consumers earn more and the spending will also be more on the consumer discretionary products. So discretion is what? Discretion is nothing but free will. Consumers buying things on the free will. So spending on these things will be more. But when an economy is in contractionary phase, these consumers usually earn less and they focus their spending more on the consumer staples. Consumer staples are nothing but the essential products used by the consumers, which can be food and clothing, etc. And in a poor economy, consumers abandon the non-essential consumer discretionary products because they want to save more. Even then, consumers still need to spend on the consumer staples, which includes basics such as food, beverage, gas, petrol, and toilet paper and others. So based on the above, we can say that spending on discretionary products or the non-essential items is defined as discretionary spending. So on the other hand, spending on essential items or non-discretionary products is called non-discretionary expense. So discretionary means one's free will, right? Sometimes we spend on our free will over and above what is essential. So that is discretionary spending, and sometimes we have to spend no matter what, irrespective of our income level, we have to spend on certain things, and that is called as non-discretionary expense. So, but due to the rise in the fuel prices on a whole, the non-discretionary expense has increased in June 2021. And if we consider the non-discretionary items like grocery and the utility services, the spending has reduced. So this is a worrying factor. So the consequence is that it distorts the non-discretionary spending of the household, that is spending on the essentials, and it also crowds out the discretionary expenses, that is an individual will not be able to purchase the luxuries as well if he is spending everything on the essentials, right? So some discretionary expenses are good for economy, such as spending on automobile. So this will in turn help the economy grow. So the automobile sector will grow, which in turn will reflect in the economy and thereby will reflect as a growth in the GDP of the economy. If the spending on the economy dies down, obviously it will have an impact on the economy. So along with this, we also have another issue with respect to rising fuel prices. So which is high fuel prices leads to high transport cost, and this in turn would eventually increase food inflation further. See, we have seen a similar circumstances in one of our previous discussion as well. Say consider a truck that is transporting rice. say we are selling rice 1 kg for 40 bucks, okay, and the diesel price has been 90. Now there has been an increase in diesel price to 100, and this increase of diesel price of 10 rupees will be added up to the rice that is being transported in the truck that is fueled by the diesel. So that will push the price of the rice much higher. So this will result in inflation of that particular commodity, which is rice that we have considered here. So coming back to the discussion, the research team also observed a decline in the bank deposits by 38% in Q1 of 2021-2022. And this is a very bad indicator because it means that people are taking their money out for spending. So it means the amount of savings available with the people has been depleting at 38%. And this in turn has led to an increase in the household debt as well. So it has increased to 37.3% of the GDP or 73.6 lakh crore. See, in this pandemic, there is a reduction in the income and some even lost their jobs. So to meet the non-discretionary expenses, that is essential expenses, households are pushed to borrow. So there is an indication of debt-financed consumption. That is, even for the essentials, these households are borrowing money to meet their food and clothing expenses. This is a very bad sign, right? Even for their sustenance, the people are living on debt. So this is what it means. And since India is a domestic consumption based economy, researchers have concluded that there will be a delay in the economic recovery. So what does this consumption based economy mean? See, India has a huge cohort of population, right? And that is being harvested as a market by the many of the manufacturers, sellers and the service providers. So because we consume more, our economy is also huge. Now with the depleting income, now when we are consuming much less, the economic activity is also going down. And because our economic growth is largely supported by the consumption of the people, it can be said that it will have a very huge impact on the economy when the demand dies down. So this is what this report says. And as a conclusion, the research team has suggested to urgently reduce the oil prices, which could be done through tax rationalization. So this brings us to the end of our discussion on this particular article. With that, let's move on to the next part of our discussion. Now let us take up this news article. See, recently the UP government announced a list of incentives and penalties to control the population growth. This editorial is written in this backdrop. So let us discuss it. Students, here is the syllabus for your reference. See, UP government recently introduced a lot of measures which was aimed at reducing UP's TFR, that is total fertility rate. See, the UP's TFR was recorded at 2.7 by the National Family Health Survey of 4 in 2016. And we all know that India is aiming for an ideal TFR of 2.1. So the TFR of 2.1 is called the replacement rate. So UP has introduced a lot of steps to bring the TFR down. Let us quickly understand what is a TFR. See, a TFR or the total fertility rate refers to the number of children that a hypothetical woman would have over a course of her reproductive life if she experienced the age-specific fertility rates observed in a given calendar. That is, the TFR is the number of children a woman can give or bear until her menopause, in other words. So this TFR of 2.1 is called as the replacement rate. So why is a TFR of 2.1 called as the replacement rate? Because a TFR of 2.1 indicates that 2 children for a couple. It means the 2 children replace their parents in the next generation. Alright, that is what the TFR of 2.1 means if it is a replacement rate. And the 0.1 is nothing but the attrition that can happen over the generations. So now coming back to the editorial. Before discussing the measures introduced by the UP government, let us learn about the International Conference on Population and Development. See, this is important from the preliminary perspective. See, the International Conference on Population and Development, it was held in 1994. And the UN organized and coordinated this conference in Cairo of Egypt. And during this meet, some 20,000 delegates from various governments, UN agencies, NGOs, and the media gathered for a discussion of variety of population issues, including that of immigration, infant mortality, birth control, family planning, education of women, protection of women from unsafe abortion services, and others. And in this conference, a lot of measures to control population were given. For example, measures like increasing the rate of modern contraceptive prevalence, male contraception, decreasing maternal mortality and infant mortality rates were highlighted during this conference. And some of the population measures taken by the UP government are in tune with this, which is appreciable. Also, the Cairo Population Conference called for measures like promotion of reproductive rights, empowering women, universal education, maternal and infant health to fight the issue of high fertility. But UP government has not taken steps for these aspects. Instead, they have taken the approach of incentive and penalties to tackle the problem of high fertility rate. See, in the draft UP Population Control Stabilization and Welfare Bill of 2021, the UP government aims to incentivize those families who have smaller number of children. For example, families with smaller number of children will be rewarded with perks in government schemes, and they will also get rebates in taxes and loans. And the UP government is also planning to give cash awards for family planning. So these are the incentives. But on the other hand, the government is planning to penalize families with a greater number of children. For example, the families with more than 2 children will be denied subsidies and welfare benefits, and they won't be eligible for government jobs, and they can't take part in elections. So we can see that UP government has chosen the path of incentives and penalties to control the population. But the incentives and penalties approach has been denounced in the past by the National Human Rights Commission. See, the incentive penalties approach is not something new and all. They were already introduced by several states in the 1990s and 2000s. For example, Haryana and the undivided Andhra Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, Chhattisgarh, Odisha, they all opted for such approaches. But it did not produce the desired results. And also, according to the various scientific studies, coercive measures like incentive penalties approach have not helped in the population control. Instead, they have had some adverse impact on the marginalized people. So, instead of relying on such coercive measures, the UP government should rely on the poverty reduction schemes and the economic reforms. See, the poverty reduction schemes and the economic reforms measures will raise the labor productivity and employment opportunity. And this will allow the families to empower the women in the household also. And if women are empowered, they will be able to make rational choices which will reduce the fertility rates. See, the India's TFRs have been reducing substantially in many states. And these states opted for the non-coercive measures like poverty reduction schemes and economic reforms to control the population. It worked. And so UP government should also go for such similar approaches rather than adopting such coercive measures to bring the fertility down. And it is better if it tackles the socio-economic issues and confront the population rather than seeking coercive approaches on the population control. So these are the important points discussed in the article. So the entire article is very important from the mains point of view, and the Cairo conference is something you will have to remember from the preliminary perspective. With that, let's move on to the next segment of our discussion today. Now, let us take up this news article for discussion. See, in this article, the author in this presents to us a comprehensive analysis on the current trends of the economic growth prospects in India. And he mainly throws light on the rising unemployment rate in particular. And by doing so, the author stresses on the need for the demand recovery in order to achieve growth recovery. Let us see how this nexus works. And this sharp revival of demand in turn needs higher per capita income. We'll discuss about all these things in detail in the subsequent part of the discussion. So here is the syllabus covered by the OPED article. See, during the month of May, the NSO under the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation released the provisional estimates of the national income for the financial year of 2020 and 2021. And according to this estimates, agriculture sector continued to be the vital sector of the economy and it had a very good growth performance. But on the contrary, the manufacturing sector saw a reduced growth rate. This is largely because of the lockdowns imposed because of the COVID-19. And a negative trend was observed in important sectors like that of trade, construction, mining, and manufacturing. So this is a matter of concern because if you see these sectors are all labor intensive, especially for low skilled jobs. So in simple words, if these sectors get affected, the laborers depend on them will also get affected. And know that the GDP at constant prices for the fourth financial quarter is showing a growth of 1.6%. See, this growth is an improvement of 0.5% over the previous quarter, but for a period when the restrictions on mobility and economic activity witnessed reduction, this performance was not up to the mark. Now, the magnitude or the extent of this economic contraction and the policy response towards it brings to the light an important issue, that is growth recovery or the question of growth prospects for the next year. So, a comprehensive analysis on the current growth rates helps us in getting better perspective on the growth recovery. So, in this regard, the author takes into account the unemployment data released by the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy. So, according to this data set, as of May 2020-2021, the rate of India's labor participation was found to be at 40%. So, which is the same as compared to the previous month of April 2021. But if you see on the contrary, the unemployment rate shot up to 11.9%, which is almost 12% in May in comparison to 8% in April. See, let us understand this better. See, the labor participation rate includes the section of the working population in the age bracket of 16 to 64. They are currently employed or unemployed, but they are ready for work. So that is what the labor participation rate is nothing but the age bracket of people belonging to 16 to 64 who are ready to work. Now, the estimation highlights the presence of a stable labor participation rate, which is at 40%, as we saw. And this implies a loss of job and fall in employment rate because the unemployment rate has gone up. The number of people ready to work is the same, but the amount of employment available to them is depressed. And in fact, the employment rate fell to 35.3% in May 2021 from the previous of 36.8% in April 2021. And remember that the month of May has become a particularly stressful month when it comes to job front. And as per data, over 15 million jobs were lost in the May 2021. This is higher than the loss of jobs witnessed during demonetization itself. So this is about the labor. Now on moving further, we know that employment and aggregate demand are entangled. How is it entangled? When a person is employed, the person has more money in her hands and thereby the person is pushed to buy something from the market, something more than food and the basics. So the demand in the market gets enhanced. In simple words, the employment and the total demand in the economy are related through the channel of disposable income of the workers. So more the income, more the demand. Likewise, the aggregate demand and the output growth also have a positive correlation or directly related. How? When a lot of people are earning more, they all will demand a lot from the market. Their needs will get more. So what will happen is the sector that is manufacturing will also be incentivized to produce more. So the output from the manufacturing sector will also see a boost. So the demand and the output growth, that is how they are positively correlated. So when viewed in this perspective, the prospect of growth revival in the upcoming years seem to be very vague. And this also creates an impact in the business confidence or the expectations on the Indian firms, especially based upon surveys on production orders and finished goods in the sector. That is what we just saw. And the recent business confidence index from the survey indicated a drop in 51.5 from the 74.2 in the previous round. So what does it highlight? It indicates the weak demand conditions in the economy to be one of the reasons. There are high chances for weak demand to remain for a longer period due to the severe impacts caused by the first wave on the household incomes and the past savings. See, this is twofold, okay? Firstly, the people might have been affected by the COVID and they might have spent towards the treatment of the particular disease. And on the other hand, people might have lost their jobs and they would have eaten up into their savings. So this is how it has affected the economy. And this was further enhanced by the uncertainty associated with the localized curbs and the muddled vaccine policy. So talking about the policy responses, as per the author, they focused more on the supply side measures with more emphasis on improving the flow of credit to important sectors and comparatively less direct action to support the vulnerable to alleviate their hardship. So what the government did through the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana and all is they gave loans to the sellers or the manufacturers to support them. But what happened is the people, the common people, the working class people, they also don't have money in their hands to buy the products that will be manufactured by the manufacturers and the sellers. So this is what the author tries to point out. And the author further moves on to mention three aspects in the government policies which made it fall short of its purpose. One is that they were more of supply side measures and not on the demand side. And secondly, a large part of all the stimulus packages announced till now will only work in the medium term and short term only. That is, they won't work on a longer term period. And thirdly, the use of credit backstops as the main plank of policy has great limitations compared to the direct measures on the demand side. Because the loans are temporary, right? They need to be repaid. If they don't repay, it will affect the economy, and the burden of repaying also will consciously rest with the manufacturers and the sellers. So this is what the author tries to mean by this. And the concern is that this could result in poor growth performance if the private investments do not pick up. And the author further concludes the editorial by suggesting some measures in the way forward. And the most important among them is to insist on the sharp revival in the overall demand. Apart from this, instead of focusing on short-term magnified growth rates, emphasis should be laid on the growth rates that have got merits in the long term. See, this is because in order to achieve higher income levels, sustained growth is required for a longer periods. So these are some of the important points mentioned in the op-ed article. With this, we have come to the end of this discussion. With this understanding in our mind, let's move on to the next part of our discussion. Now, let us take up this news article. So we have discussed elaborately about the Information Technology Guidelines for Intermediaries and Digital Media Ethics Code Rules 2021. So that was discussed in February 28th itself. Today, let us see an editorial which criticizes lawmaking without discussion and openness and with government overreach. Here is the syllabus relevant to this editorial. First of all, know that Rules 2021 was framed under the IT Act of 2000. What it did was it superseded the earlier IT Intermediary Guidelines Rules 2011, and it seeks to provide a grievance redressal mechanism for users of digital platforms of all kinds. And what all does it include? It includes the social media sites, messaging apps, over-the-top streaming services, the digital news publishers and others. So it's quite comprehensive, as you can see. Now let us see some of the provisions of the rules which attracted criticism. See, the rules require the intermediaries and the digital media publishers to provide for a grievance redressal mechanism. So what is this grievance redressal mechanism? This is nothing but where aggrieved consumer has a forum to report that something has gone wrong with her in a particular transaction. So a reporting mechanism which can be escalated within the organization to resolve the grievance of the service or the goods receiver is what is called as the grievance redressal mechanism. So, in case of a digital media publisher such as the news and the OTT, that is over the top services, a 3-tier grievance redressal mechanism will deal with complaints regarding the content. And the first level is self-regulation by the publishers. And then comes the self-regulating bodies of the publishers. And finally, there will be an oversight mechanism by the central government. So if you have to take it similar to the normal media, let us consider, for example, self-regulation by the publisher is, say a newspaper is publishing something, they themselves is self-regulating. And then comes the self-regulation by the self-regulating bodies of publishers. Here it can be Press Council of India. And finally, there will be an oversight mechanism by the central government. So what I'm saying is these mechanism is for the print media that is already in existence. A similar mechanism is being brought in for the internet services, right? And as a part of the oversight mechanism, the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting will establish a interdepartmental committee. So, it will hear grievances not addressed by self-regulatory bodies, and they will also oversee adherence to the code of ethics. And not just that, in case of emergencies, the authorized officers may examine digital media content. And the Secretary of the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, which is MIB, may pass an interim direction for blocking of such contents as well. And according to FICCI, the OTT platforms and the entertainment industry had reached about 1.82 trillion rupees in 2019 itself. And if you see, it is projected to cross 2.4 trillion by 2022. So as per the editorial, there are about 550 million televisions and smartphone consumers in India, and these figures are only expected to double by 2025. So you can imagine the amount of reach that these OTT platforms and the internet services or the social media will have on the people. So that is what these figures convey. Now coming to OTT, as of now, there are about 200 million OTT subscribers. With the above mentioned factors, the OTT is poised to grow to new levels in the coming days. But many of the provisions of the new rules indicates government's overreach in the sector. So this will not be good for the growth of the OTT sector. See, this is not the case in other countries and all. See, if you see the EU, the Audiovisual Media Services Directive encourages self-regulation and co-regulation among the players. If you see in the US, OTT content remains unregulated still. And most of these countries focus on regulating content with respect to child safety and violence and hate speech. Thus, they have set up an enabling architecture for the OTT platforms to grow. And it is not just about the overreach, okay? It is also about the transparency of our legislation. So that is what the author has dealt with. See, the author says the new rules were pushed through without much discussion on it, either in the parliament or in the public. See, if you remember, Cable TV Networks Regulation Amendment Bill was introduced in 2007. There were about months of discussion with all the stakeholders. And this act was amended in the later days after intense discussion, even after the amendment, with all the stakeholders. And this is a healthy trend in democracy, where all the stakeholders get together, they discuss, and all the deliberations is done before a legislation is passed. So what will this do is, it will make sure that the controversial provisions would be diluted, and thereby it will ensure that the legislation shall have more acceptability. So had the government adopted this system while framing the new IT rules, it would have had more acceptability among the leading OTT platforms. So to conclude, we can say that the pre-legislative scrutiny is an essential feature of a democracy. So there shall be greater transparency in the policy making process. Also, we need to prevent lobbying, and thereby we need to ensure equality of access for all stakeholders in engaging with the process. And above all, the discussions and transparency indicate trust in the people by an elected government. So as the government has proposed the amendments for the Cinematograph Act of 1952, we saw that it had a lot of controversial provisions in one of our previous discussions. So let us see whether they will follow these steps. They have put it up for public deliberation as of now. but we don't know how much of the comments that the public is giving is going to be taken up by the government. So let us wait and watch regarding that. So with that information, let's move on to the next segment of the discussion. Our next discussion is based on this data point. This provides data including pupil-teacher ratio. This data is based on UDISE report of 2019 and 2020. See, UDISE stands for Unified District Information System for Education, and it was initiated in 2012 and 13 for providing a robust real-time and credible information collection mechanism. And this is important for an objective evaluation of the education system. So, UDISE was developed with the purpose to collect the school details, that is, the factors related to a school and its resources. See, the information collected is utilized for planning, for optimized resource allocation, for implementation of various education-related programs, and for the assessment of progress. Now, based on the information collected, UDISE publishes a report containing the salient results at all India level in the education system. And our discussion is based on the report for 2019 and 20, as we saw earlier. And it provides information like enrollment of students, number of teachers, school infrastructure, and others. But we are going to focus only on the data related to the teachers trained to teach with a computer and about the pupil-teacher ratio, that is PTR. First, about teachers trained to teach with a computer. See, this assessment assumes importance in this pandemic era where online education is gaining ground. And as per the data, the proportion varies according to the level of management, like the government aided and others. And overall, it could be seen that the states fared much better in case of private schools comparing to the other management levels. But it was found that only 15% of the teachers were trained to teach with a computer in the government schools. And in that too, in states like Bihar, MP and Odisha, the proportion was much worse at only 3%. And what does this mean? This means the distress is not only on the teacher but also on the students relying on them, because they will also not know to operate the computer, right? And on the contrary, some states have real improvement where more than 50% of teachers are trained to teach using computers to teach online. So this includes Gujarat, Maharashtra and Punjab. And next is the pupil-teacher ratio. See, the PTR at different levels of education shows the availability of adequate number of teachers for teaching the children enrolled at different levels of education. Simply put, it provides the number of students per teacher. So what is the mandated PTR? So as per the Right of Children to Free and Compulsory Education Act of 2009, PTR for primary school should be 30:1 and for upper primary schools it should be 35:1. And additionally, the Rashtriya Madhyamik Shiksha Abhiyan, which is RMSA framework, it stipulates that the pupil-teacher ratio at the secondary level should be 30:1. And the advantage of maintaining this PTR is multifold. First, it enables the teacher to cater to different learning styles of the students. And this will ensure that they stay engaged and they understand what is being taught in a better fashion. And in other words, a low PTR enables teachers to pay individual attention to students, which leads to increase in the student achievement, because it enables the students to have a better absorption understanding of the subject. So, a low PTR is essential for long-term and broad-based academic achievement. Therefore, PTR is closely related to the quality of teaching in the schools. It also ensures the rational deployment of teachers and thereby ensuring that there is no urban or rural imbalance in the teacher postings. And apart from that, it also provides for prohibition of deployment of teachers for non-educational work. So all that said, what is the current scenario? So let us know that from some data. See, this graph shows the PTR for different levels of education during 2012 and 13 to 2019 to 20. And we can see a substantial increase from 2012-13 to 2019-20. And the PTR is also less than 30:1 for 2019-20 at all levels of education. And if we consider the state level data, look at the graph. For most states, it is within the mandated range of 30:1. But for certain states, the ratio was more than 40:1 at the higher secondary level. So as you can see, there are states like Odisha, Jharkhand, UP and Bihar. And most worryingly, Bihar's PTR was far worse than the primary and the secondary levels. And sometimes it even crossed 50:1. This means these states have comparatively low quality of teaching in the schools. So this entire data point emphasizes the importance of pupil-teacher ratio and its implication on the teaching standards. So you can expect the entire discussion as a mains question in the exam. So this brings us to the end of the discussion on this particular topic on data point. With that, let's move on to the next segment of the discussion. Now see this news article. See, this news article talks about a gesture by India to Georgia. So which in turn strengthens the India-Georgia ties. See, this gesture is the gifting of a part of the relics or remains of St. Queen Ketevan to Georgia by India. And St. Queen Ketevan's remains were unearthed by the ASI, that is Archaeological Survey of India, few years ago. So in this context, let us know some facts related to St. Queen Ketevan. See, St. Queen Ketevan was the 17th century Georgian queen. She was unfortunately murdered in 1624, that is about 400 years ago, in the Shiraz city of the present-day Iran. So according to historical sources, in 1614, the king of Georgia, who is King Teimuraz, sent Queen Ketevan as a negotiator to Shah Abbas I. See, Shah Abbas I of Persia was the 5th Safavid Shah of Iran, that is king of Iran. And Queen Ketevan was sent to prevent any attacks by an Iranian army and attack on a place called Kakheti. So Kakheti was an eastern province of Georgia, but she failed to prevent the attack. So it is said that she surrendered herself as honorary hostage to Iran due to this failed attempt. And after that, she was held as hostage in Shiraz for several years. But it seems King Teimuraz was recalcitrant, that is, resisted the authority of the control of Shah Abbas I. So in an act of revenge, Shah Abbas ordered the queen to convert her religion. See, many Georgians are members of the Georgian Orthodox Church. So Abbas I ordered the queen to renounce her own religion, but she refused. So this made the Abbas I to torture her to death with red-hot pincers. So this unfortunate event happened in 1624, and her martyrdom was witnessed by St. Augustine, Portuguese Catholic missionaries. And these missionaries, what they did was they secretively, in an illicit way, took portions of the remains of the queens because of the immense spiritual value of the relic. They took it to Georgia, where the relics were interred at the Alaveredi monastery of Georgia. And rest of her remains were buried at the Church of St. Augustine in Goa in India. But the holy relics remained lost because St. Augustine Church collapsed in 1842. And the Georgians took several expeditions to Goa in 21st century to bring back the remains, but they could not be found at all. But in 2005, parts of the bone of the right arm of the queen was found at Goa St. Augustine's Church, and it was found by the ASI. The authenticity of the remains were confirmed only in 2013, and from then on it was with the Indian government. As a diplomatic gesture, India has gifted a part of the relics to Georgia. So it is said that the relics are likely to be put on display in India as well as in Georgia. So this move of India is expected to strengthen the bond of friendship between the countries. So this is an interesting piece of news article that we spotted in the news today. So this will be a refreshing departure from the monotonous discussion of our news analysis. So with that, let's move on to the next segment of our discussion today. Now look at this article. See, it is about the excavation of a terracotta ring well from the Keeladi site. See, so far many ring wells have been excavated from this site, but this new recovery is special because it is the first time a terracotta ring well with a thumb impression has been excavated from this site. So far, only plain terracotta ring wells have been discovered from this site. So that is why this is very special. And in this context, let us discuss about Keeladi. See, Keeladi is located in the southeast to the present day Madurai of Tamil Nadu. And it is located on the banks of river Vaigai. Since 2015, the archaeological excavations have been going on in Keeladi, and these excavations are conducted by the Tamil Nadu Archaeological Department, and they are carried out in different phases. And during each phase, a lot of exciting discoveries are being unearthed. Now, let us see about these discoveries that are very important for the exams. See, in Keeladi, a lot of interesting artifacts have been unearthed, right? For example, a pottery with a Tamil Brahmi inscription, gold coins, beads, iron tools, jewelry, charcoal were unearthed from this site. And these discoveries show that an urban civilization existed in Tamil Nadu. And also, based on these excavations, the archaeologists believe that the recovered artifacts could be dated to a period between 6th century BCE and the 1st century CE. BCE means before the Common Era, and CE means Common Era. See, this is an important discovery. So, because it shows the second urbanization that happened in the Vaigai plains of Tamil Nadu around the 6th century before the Common Era, that is BCE, as it happened in the Gangetic Plains. So we all know that the first urbanization is the Indus Valley civilization, and the Indus Valley civilization roughly happened around 5000 years ago in the 3rd millennium BCE. Now coming back to Keeladi, see, in Keeladi many potteries with Tamil Brahmi inscriptions were recovered. This shows that the people who lived in this area attained literacy or learnt the art of writing as early as the 6th century BCE. Also, the archaeologists have recovered skeletal fragments of cow or ox, buffalo, sheep, goat, wild boar from the site. So, from these skeletal remains, experts have concluded that an agrarian society had existed in Keeladi, and they have also reared cattle. And in addition to that, the archaeologists have also recovered materials associated with the traditional weaving from this site. For example, the spindle whorls and the copper needles were excavated from this place. So what does this show? This shows that the Keeladi had a well-established, thriving weaving industry. So in addition to that, the archaeologists have recovered the remains of the long walls, well-laid floors, roof tiles from this site. So what does this show? This indicates that the Keeladi had a very high standard of living. So we can see that there has been an urban settlement which flourished at Keeladi since the 6th century BCE. And more excavations from this site will give us more interesting facts about the history of this place. So with that information, we conclude the discussion on Keeladi. Let's move on to the next segment of the discussion. Now let us take up this news article. See, this news article is about vaccination and vaccine hesitancy. We are not going to discuss in detail about this elaborately in many of our previous discussions. So because this is published, we'll just discuss the new informations, and apart from that, it will be more like refreshing the information that we had already discussed only. Alright, now let's get into the discussion. So as we know, the vaccination drive in India began in Jan 2021. So as of now, crores of people have been vaccinated. But we must recognize the major challenges in vaccinating the entire population. See, the foremost challenge has been the supply deficit. Most of us do not get the vaccine slot to get ourselves vaccinated. So this problem shall be mitigated by the reorientation of the vaccine policy, in which the union government took charge of 75% of the total procurement, which is a welcome move. Now, two other complex challenges that need immediate focus are the vaccine hesitancy and the much discussed digital divide in the country. So now let us discuss the OPID, which talks about the vaccine hesitance in India. So if you remember, the WHO has come forward with the BESD model, that is Behavior and Social Drivers Vaccination Model. See, it emphasized on the motivation as the vanguard of human psychology during the vaccination drive. Now, following this, the US and Israel have successfully driven up their COVID vaccination coverage by incentivizing and motivating citizens. And unfortunately, in India, misinformation and misplaced beliefs have led to fears about the potential harmful effects of the vaccine. And the diversity of India necessitates community engagement at the local level to counter this narrative of misinformation. There is a need to engage with people at the lowest level, at the grassroots level, to shun the fear about the vaccination. Now, coming to our health system, we followed a target based approach for all these years. Here, the grassroots health workers are given a target, and this transformed most of our health programs into a target chasing exercise. So, what happened is this undermined the trust of the public health system. So, people often avoid contact with the health facilities for even the routine health services, which is very much necessary. So, what are the reasons behind the vaccine hesitancy now? So, first of all, COVID-19 vaccines are new entrants. So, they don't have years of results to prove their importance. So, despite this, they have been rolled out at an unprecedented scale, which is a laudable thing. And these, coupled with media reporting of the adverse events and the rumor mongering through social media, fuels suspicion. So what happens is there is lack of trust in the vaccine that is being circulated. So for the vaccination to be successful, what is needed is first we need to rebuild the trust. So for this, we must look at the real problem. See, this issue cannot be resolved just by pouring in more resources, manpower, and coming up with new policies alone. No, that alone won't help. Instead, focus on input deficiencies. So, we must focus on simple information, education, communication exercise. And if not addressed, trust deficiency among communities in the health system can lead to avoidance of public health facilities by many in the future also. So, the public health facilities will not be sought after by the public even when they are in need. And this is the right time to address this trust deficit by engaging in the information, education, communication exercise. And in order to curb the spread of misinformation, government should also publish reliable data on disease and the damage prevention after vaccination. This is very important. So government should be very transparent about the adverse events associated with the vaccination and the role vaccines can play in fighting newer variants and the upcoming waves. This should also be highlighted by the government in order to push the vaccination closer to the people. And a successful information campaign requires dissemination through mediums that invoke trust. So what should be done is local languages and dialects should be used to engage people. So what can be done? Local television channels can be used. Regional newspapers can be used as media to reach out to the people. And besides that, local artists can also be encouraged to ideate and innovate through music, murals, graffiti, dance and drama as well. For example, in the tribal districts of Chhattisgarh, popular folk songs are being used to highlight the benefits of vaccination. So measures like these can take vaccination closer to people, and this will help our country battle the upcoming wave of the pandemic. So this brings us to the end of the discussion on this editorial. So this editorial, as we saw earlier, is largely about vaccine hesitancy. This is more of a refreshing reminder about the vaccine hesitancy and the ways to overcome it. One thing you can take away as new is about the tribal districts of Chhattisgarh is using a popular folk song to highlight the benefits of vaccination. You can quote this as a case study in your mains answers, and this can also be used as a case study for anthropology preparation. With that, let's move on to the next segment of our discussion. Now here we are at the last segment of today's discussion, practice preliminary questions. So we have 2 questions for today's discussion. Let's go over it one by one. So the first question for today is based on Georgia. Remember, we had a small article on Queen Saint Kitaban. So based on that, we'll be discussing Georgia's geography through this question. So the question asks, which of the following country does not border Georgia? We have 4 options in this regard. See, look at this map. Georgia is bounded on the north and the northeast by Russia. And on the east and the southeast we have Azerbaijan. And on the south by Armenia and Turkey. And we have the Black Sea on the west. So this is not a landlocked country and all. So from this information, we can see that Iran does not border Georgia. So our answer is option C, Iran. Now, moving on to the next question. Consider the following statement with reference to Unified District Information System for Education. Our data point article discussion today was based on this. So this question is inspired from that. So it's a two-statement question. So the first statement is this. It was developed by Integrated District Information System for Education for elementary and secondary education. See, UDISE was for providing a robust and a real-time information collection mechanism for an objective evaluation of the education system. We saw this in the discussion. And it was developed by DISE, which comes under Ministry of Education. So this option 1 is true. Now, the second option is this. UDISE Plus is its updated online version that collects data in real time. See, this statement is also correct because UDISE is an updated and improvised version of the already existing UDISE. Importantly, the entire system is now online and it has been collecting data on the real time even from 2018-19 itself. And if you see, UDISE Plus has a mandate of collecting information from all recognized and unrecognized schools that are imparting formal education from the pre-primary to the 12th standard. And if you see, the information collected is utilized for the planning of the resource allocation and for implementation of the various education related programs. And it is also utilized for the assessment of the progress. So with this information, we understand the correct option is option C, both 1 and 2. So with that, we are at the end of the practice preliminary question section discussion. So here are some of the main questions inspired from our discussion today. Write the answers and post it in the comment section for peer review. If you like the video, like, share, comment and subscribe. Stay home, stay safe. Good day.